The paper is entitled African American Expatriates in Ghana and the Long Hot Summer of the 1960s. And it certainly gives a different sense, as Mary said, of African Americans' engagement with Africa and its relevance for the civil rights movement. And you know, so I'm talking about a different kind of engagement with Africa, but I think I'm talking about a few other themes too. Constructions of black agency and issues around violence, and and I see this as, you know, sort of evolving out of the previous work, but turning into a new project about racial ideology during the 1960s. So I really look forward to your comments and questions and criticisms. In 1968, Kwame Nkrumah learned of the assassination of Martin Luther King while in exile in Conakry, Guinea. Nkrumah, formerly president of Ghana, had been overthrown by a military coup in 1966. In 1968, King's death had convinced Nkrumah, who had survived 2 assassination attempts while in office, of the violence and hypocrisy at the heart of American society. As he presciently wrote to a correspondent, quote, "Yesterday Malcolm, today Luther King, tomorrow fires all over the United States," end of quote. As you know, Nkrumah's prediction of civic unrest in many cities across the United States after King's assassination was an accurate one. Shortly before his murder, King had been condemned by opinion leaders not only for his opposition to the war in Vietnam, but also for what they perceived as his personal failure to maintain nonviolence as a guiding principle of the movement. King's fall from grace might partly be explained by the expectations of nonviolent social change held by many Western officials and observers at the time of the U.S. Civil Rights Movement and Ghana's independence in 1957. The violence and chaos of 1968 was a far cry from the idealism and goodwill generated when Ghana gained its independence from British colonial rule in, as I said, 57. Nkrumah and his new nation had symbolized widespread hopes for nonviolent political change. King's own deep commitment to nonviolence was probably reinforced by his presence at Ghana's independence ceremonies, fresh from his early triumph as leader of the Montgomery bus boycott. Upon his return, King told his congregation in Montgomery that Ghana demonstrated that the moral arc of the universe inclines towards justice. King's hopeful vision of change, one curiously, at this moment anyway, devoid of any sense of human struggle, would find an echo in the declaration in 1960 by British Prime Minister Harold Macmillan that characterized national independence movements in Africa as a wind of change that was sweeping the African continent. Although King would not be able to maintain his early optimism, he never abandoned his faith in nonviolence. Nkrumah, however, had abandoned his support for nonviolence shortly after Macmillan's pragmatic acknowledgement of African nationalism. Nkrumah became convinced of the necessity for armed struggle for African liberation movements, and there were several events that forced him to rethink nonviolence for the relevance of nonviolence for African liberation struggles. Events including the secession crisis in the Congo, the failure of the United Nations peacekeeping mission in the Congo, also violent French resistance to the independence movement in Algeria, and also repressive white minority regimes in southern Africa. Now, there are many reasons and events to mark 1968 as a watershed in U.S. and global history, but in this paper I'd like to question or qualify the emphasis on 1968 from the standpoint of African American radicals in Ghana and those based in the United States. For them, the events that constituted a defining moment in their political imagination came much earlier. In short, roughly speaking, their 1968 occurred in 1961. Now, 1960 was widely heralded in the U.S. and Western press as the Year of Africa, during which time it was anticipated that over 30 new African nations would gain independence. The secession crisis and subsequent civil war in the newly independent Congo, which had been colonized by Belgium, shattered expectations of orderly political change. Immediately after the Congo's independence ceremonies, Belgian military and government officials had engineered the secession of the Congo's mineral-rich Katanga region, subverting the new nation's sovereignty. Prime Minister Patrice Lumumba had appealed to the United Nations to oppose the secession and was present at the General Assembly. Eisenhower administration officials rejected Lumumba's appeal for assistance. The announcement of Lumumba's death by Belgian authorities in February of 1961 was greeted with worldwide condemnation. Lumumba, who was executed while in the custody of Belgian troops, had been widely portrayed in the Western press as a pro-communist upstart, as if to offer justification for his removal. So it seemed to some African Americans who were already frustrated with the slow pace of desegregation in the United States, compounded by distressing incidents of racial discrimination against visiting African diplomats. In Harlem, Lumumba's death was the last straw for a group of African American visitors to the United Nations Security Council, including writers Leroy Jones and Maya Angelou, who, along with members of several black nationalist and cultural organizations, vented their fury with an angry demonstration in the gallery, replete with shouted denunciations of the crime and physical skirmishes with UN guards. And so what I'd like to do now is show you a newsreel that contains a visual record of this demonstration, but it also gives you a sense of the Cold War ideology of the time. This was done by Pathé Studios, shown certainly to American audiences, and it begins with an account of the Congo crisis, the demonstrations, the worldwide demonstrations in response to Lumumba's death, and it gives a little expose treatment of Lumumba, and then moves on to the demonstration. This is raw footage from a film archive, so it has the numbers on it and all that. So bear with me with the clip. But you can see during the demonstration Maya Angelou coming down the stairs and yelling, and I think you can hear her too if you listen carefully. It's bedlam. It's an amazing document to see the demonstration, but also the Cold War framing of the whole Congo crisis and Lumumba's significance. So let's go to the film.
The slaying of Patrice Lumumba, deposed Congo premier, touches off worldwide demonstrations, small groups of students and others, as here in Chicago and in London. Credulous pawns, it is believed, of communists and their dupes, in deliberate, organized attempts to undermine democracy and the United Nations. They hardly speak for the rank and file. In Moscow, where such scenes are rare unless propaganda is served, demonstrators converge on the Belgian embassy, attacking the Belgians and Dag Hammarskjöld, even as Russia withdraws recognition of the Secretary General. Here is the symbol of the turmoil in the Congo, the late Patrice Lumumba, the left-leaning nationalist agitator, head of the Congolese national movement which catapulted him to the premiership. But in 2 months he was out, deposed by arch-political rival President Joseph Kasavubu, who accused him of pro-communism and of creating chaos. Earlier, Lumumba visited the UN with his pro-Ran Vice Premier Antoine Gizenga, who later set up a separatist regime which the Kremlin supports, leading President Moise Tshomba of the secessionist province of Katanga to state that it threatens a Korean situation in the Congo. And it was in Katanga that Lumumba met his death. He's shown in last pictures when he was flown in for detention, later to be slain by tribesmen, touching off the new crisis.